Thank you for all coming here. I think this is a very important issue. From my perspective, I think I'm here to talk about Sharia law courts, women's rights issues, secularism, and why we need equality and one law for all, not just in Britain, but across the world. I think if you look at the issue of Sharia courts, there's a lot of issues around this, and obviously I won't be addressing all of them in my talk, but hopefully more of it will come out in the comments and questions section at the end of the discussion. Now, I think there is no place for Sharia courts here in Britain, or anywhere for that matter, for a number of reasons, but particularly because it's discriminatory and misogynist at best, as are all religious laws. Now, one of the things that we often hear is that, well, you know, there's no amputations and stonings taking place. This is a question of family matters, civil matters. And so, you know, you shouldn't be scaremongering and speaking out against Sharia courts. But I guess the question that comes up in this instance is something that a women's rights campaigner, Geeta Sahka, said. She said, just because there are no amputations and stonings, but because women's rights in the family are being violated, doesn't make it less scandalous and less important, and a matter that we need to think of and be wary of. In fact, if you look at countries which have Sharia law and Islamic law, you find that the civil aspects of Sharia law are some of the biggest pillars of women's oppression in those societies. Now, there's a couple of things that are related to civil matters. For example, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's, so you need 2 women to testify for every man that testifies. Divorce is unilateral for a man. Men have unilateral right to divorce, whereas women don't. Child custody is given to the father at a preset age, irrespective of the welfare of the child, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the examples. Now, if you look at the question of testimony, which basically says that you need 2 women for every man that testifies, the Islamic Sharia Council, their website, clearly explains why. It says, if one forgets, it's so that the other one can remind her. It's the difference between a man's and a woman's brains. A woman's character is not so good for a case where testimony requires concentration and attention. I hope you don't need to concentrate too much here, women in this group. And this also applies to divorce. The Sharia Council website explains, women are governed by emotion, men by their minds. So he will think twice before uttering talaq or divorce. It goes on to say that this is not derogatory, but it is the secret of women's nature. Now, proponents of Sharia courts, and there are quite a few of them, unfortunately, they say that, you know, it's absurd to assume that there's some sort of misogyny and discrimination going on in Sharia courts, to assume that without looking at the facts. Now, one of the examples they give is, well, 80% of the users of Sharia courts are women. And, you know, based on this defense, I could say that passbooks during racial apartheid in South Africa were pro-black because 100% of black people had to carry them. You know, when you look at the situation where men have the unilateral right to divorce, they don't need to go to Sharia court, then you understand why women are higher users of the court. And it doesn't then necessarily mean that therefore it's not discriminatory and it's pro-women's rights. Quite the contrary. Now, proponents of Sharia courts will also often say that there's no evidence that it's discriminatory. And there is ample evidence. There is ample evidence. If you look at the report we have outside that One Law for All has published on Sharia law in Britain, a threat to one law for all and equal rights, you see a couple of studies on this. One is from the Center of Islamic Pluralism. They did a study of 90 Muslim women in London, West Midlands, and Lancashire and West Yorkshire. And many of them felt that they didn't get a fair hearing in the Sharia courts. Now, one of the cases that the Center for Islamic Pluralism uncovered was the case of a 30-year-old woman from West Yorkshire who was 13 when her father forced her to get married. And she says in this report that she went to 3 different Sharia courts, and all of them said that her marriage was legal under Sharia law. And even though she says, this is I quote, "I told them I had been forced, but they said that did not change anything. She eventually only managed to secure a divorce when her husband finally agreed to it." And there's just a new report now come out, it's I think a day old, where girls as young as 9 are being forced to marry in Sharia courts. If you look at the Ministry of Justice details that have just been revealed, for over 30 applications of forced marriage protection orders in 2011, 5 or fewer were made out to protect girls from 9 to 11. Now, going aside from the civil matters that we're addressing, they're also addressing criminal matters, even though they say that they're not. For example, marital rape. It is a crime in this country, not under Sharia law. You have a Sharia judge, Sheikh Maulana Abu Saeed, who's also a war criminal, by the way. He said that marital rape is, quote, "not an aggression because when they got married, sexual intercourse was part of the marriage." In fact, calling it rape is the aggression. And Muslim arbitration tribunals have addressed several domestic violence cases, again, a criminal offense in this country, but not under the Sharia courts. And in all of them, the women have been, the women have decided to drop charges against their husbands, and the men have been sent to anger management courses. And you've even got a case in Spain where a woman has been sentenced to death by stoning in a court in Valls, Catalonia. Now, while there's ample evidence of what's going on with Sharia courts, even if there was no evidence, the fact that the law itself should be sufficient in order for us to realize that there's something seriously wrong here. If there was not one black person in South Africa during apartheid who said that they had faced discrimination and racism, we would still know that there was discrimination and racism taking place because the law was unfair and discriminatory. And it's the same with Sharia law. It's discriminatory, particularly against women. Now, in addition, it's not as if this is a new phenomenon where we have no idea what it looks like. There are Sharia courts, and law is now the fastest growing implemented law worldwide. And we see its results in other countries as well. In fact, what's interesting, if you look at a Sharia court in Iran, for example, the rulings in the civil court is not very different from the rulings of a Sharia court right here in Britain. Now, one of the things I want to add here to say is that the thing about Sharia courts is that it's often portrayed as the demand and desire of Muslims because they become more pious. And one of the things I want to refer to here is that, in my opinion, this is a direct result of the rise of Islamism. It's not that Muslims have become more pious. The demand for Sharia law is a demand for Islamism, in fact, to restrict and limit the rights of people, and particularly Muslims and women. Now, some will say that, fine, it's discriminatory. They're adult women, they decide what they want to do. It's none of your business. Well, I mean, from our perspective, it's not that clear-cut because it's not necessarily a choice, and it's not voluntary for many of the women who go to these courts. For example, there was a study done by a university law professor at Reading, the University of Reading law professor. She sat in on 10 Sharia court cases, and of those 10 cases, 4 of the women had civil injunctions against their husbands for violent and threatening behavior. Nonetheless, their husbands had dragged them to these courts to renegotiate child custody and financial settlements and so on and so forth. And she says, in this way, this is her quote, and she's a Muslim, by the way, in this way, these privatized legal processes were ignoring not only state law intervention and due process, but providing little protection and safety for the women in question. Furthermore, their interviews and observation data revealed that husbands use this opportunity to negotiate reconciliation, financial settlements for divorce, and in many cases, access to children. Now, again, I think it's hard to ascertain the choice and voluntary nature of the women who go to these courts, particularly since Islamism is a very scary movement. It's very, very scary. It frightens a lot of people, Muslims included. It threatens a lot of people, Muslims included. And so, you have the Sharia court, for example, saying, if you belittle Sharia law or call it out of date, this constitutes disbelief. And we know what the penalty for disbelief is. In my opinion, using words like rights, I think you might find it funny, but a lot of people don't, or choice, are merely public relations ploys by Islamists and their supporters. And I find it absurd that Islamists would talk of choice, because wherever they have power, there is no choice. There is no choice for people living under their rule. And, using that, the concept of choice is very deceptive. It reminds me of the hadith on stoning. The woman begged Muhammad to stone her. She had to come back 3 times before he agreed. It was her choice. Or you have scholars from the Institute of Oriental Studies in India reporting that out of 40 eyewitness accounts of sati, where women are meant to throw themselves on the burning pyres of their husbands, only 2 of them were forced. The rest were voluntary, and therefore that makes sati fine. It's very easy to use words like choice and voluntary nature of things when you are dealing with a movement like Islamism that very often leaves no choice for people. I'm going to leave the discussion on Sharia law there. I know that's enough already to explode the room. But I want to still take a bit of my time to talk about freedom of expression, because I think it's very linked to this issue. Because if we aren't allowed to speak about it, we're not going to be able to make changes, the changes that I think, as 21st century human beings, we need to have. Now, when you look at the concept of freedom of expression in the West, in Britain, for example, I personally find it absurd how issues of Islam and freedom of expression have been framed within a context of offense, Islamophobia, and racism. And in my opinion, these are bogus accusations that serve Islamism in the same way that Sharia law serves Islamists when they are in power. It helps to threaten, it helps to intimidate, and it helps to silence criticism and dissent. In my opinion, charges of offense and Islamophobia are the equivalent of secular fatwas. It's a warning from the powers that be, whether it be the state, whether it be an educational system, a student union, a college headmaster, an employer, of what's acceptable and unacceptable, what is sacred and cannot be and must not be challenged. And the devious thing about using offense, because this is what we hear all the time, we're offended. You can't talk about it. We're offended. You can't use the Jesus and Mo image. We're offended. You're not allowed to speak about Sharia law at this university campus or that. Whereas every day Islamists go on those university campuses and easily talk about throwing gay people off buildings and stoning adulterers to death, and it seems, that's fine. The devious thing about offense is that it's subjective, isn't it? We're not necessarily offended by the same things. The religious are usually offended more often than not, and Islamists are offended all the time. They're offended if you're gay, if you're unveiled, if you leave Islam, if you listen to music, if you dance, if you have religiously unsanctioned sex, if you're a woman, if you want to have shake hands with a member of the opposite sex, and on and on. And hiding behind the excuse of offense, Islamists are basically saying that because it's deemed offensive, and they're the ones making the judgment call, you have to limit your right to free expression. And what's even more interesting is not everything that's offensive is off limits. What offends me isn't off limits, nor should it be. Now, it's interesting that Islamists can say whatever they want, quoting the Quran and Hadith, but if you or I criticize or mock Islam or Islamism, We're the ones who are causing offense. Now, one of the things they talk about is that offense is a principle that we can't violate. Well, if it was a principle, most likely they would not be able to say many of the things that they say, because it is offensive to 21st century sensibilities. But in addition to that, if you're talking about our right to free expression, my right to free expression, then it is mine, isn't it? Mine to express any way that I want. You can choose to express it your way, I can choose to express it mine. We have to be careful about bartering away free expression on behalf of people who want to speak out against Islam, Islamism, and Sharia law. The other issue is that the form of expression is irrelevant. You don't like a cartoon. You don't like a depiction of an image of Muhammad. You don't like discussions about Sharia courts. It's irrelevant. In the same way that it's irrelevant what the woman who was raped was wearing when she was raped. It's irrelevant. And that's what freedom of expression means, the right to also be able to offend. Without the right to offend, it becomes meaningless. And what's happened now, therefore, is that actually people who speak out are the ones who are blamed for inciting violence, for having meetings cancelled, and for having mobs hanging out somewhere outside threatening them. You blame it. What happens with this sort of climate where everything, you have to be careful about not offending anyone, is that if you do offend someone, then you're at fault for actually doing what is very normal, and that is dissenting and arguing and rejecting a certain belief system and arguing and debating it out. Now, I think this whole idea of defending polite and inoffensive free expression only aids Islamism at the expense of the many who are living under it, opposing it, and questioning it. And what it does is it fails to recognize the realities of a medieval movement with political power that is spearheading an Islamic inquisition, in my opinion, and that is the cause of incalculable misery and barbarity. Now, what's happened then is that people and citizens don't seem to matter anymore. It's all about inclusion of and respect of beliefs, however reactionary and misogynist. But there is a crucial difference between beliefs and group of people. And therefore, criticizing beliefs has nothing to do with racism or discrimination whatsoever. Now, there's a lot of reasons for why this is so, and we can talk about that maybe when we open this up to discussions. I want to speak for another 5 minutes, if I may. Partly it has to do with the racism of lower expectations, in my opinion. Partly it has to do with the climate of intimidation and censorship that the Islamists have established. Partly it has to do with the perception that Islam is an oppressed religion that's bullied by US imperialism, as if US-led militarism and Islamism are not two sides of the same coin. Or that Islam is a minority religion, as if there are no minority freethinkers, atheists, and ex-Muslims. And partly it has to do with multiculturalism, which gives identity politics supremacy at the expense of individuals within a constructed, homogeneous Muslim community, thereby portraying and legitimating Islamist sensibilities as the offended sensibilities of all Muslims. Have you noticed how the authentic Muslim voice is always the most regressive? This perspective doesn't see the woman who is forced to go to Sharia court, doesn't see the girl who doesn't want to wear a veil, doesn't see the young person who's facing honor-based violence because of falling in love with the wrong person, the one who's gay, who's a free thinker, who's a secularist, who's an ex-Muslim, and so on and so forth, and who's causing offense within the so-called Muslim community day in and day out. And respect, like offense, is another prescription for demarcating that which we're not allowed to question or challenge. As the late Mansur Hekmat says, people's beliefs are only really respectable to themselves. Of course, human beings are worthy of the highest respect, but not necessarily their beliefs. This doesn't mean that people don't have a right to their beliefs. They do as a private affair. But having that right doesn't mean they don't have a right not to be offended, or that their beliefs have to be respected or tolerated or deemed equal and equally valid to all other beliefs. Now, Islamophobia is another one, which I think is a bogus and political term used to scaremonger people into silence by attributing human qualities to Islam and Islamism in order to rule out and deem racist any opposition or criticism. But criticism, mockery, opposition to, and even hatred of a belief is not racism. It's not. And in my opinion, concepts such as offense, such as respect and Islamophobia are not there to protect Muslims from bigotry, but to protect Islam and Islamism. Which is why Islamists insist on blurring the distinction between Muslims and Islam and Islamism, both so they can feign representation and also ensure that Islam stays off limits. But Islam, like any belief system, cannot be off limits. It must be open to criticism and offense. Anything worth expressing will cause offense. And those who say that expression is offensive are looking at it from their own self-interest within the context of offense. They aim to challenge those that want to challenge things in society. It's a means of control, censorship, and limiting rights. Limiting free expression to that which is acceptable restricts this right to speak for those who need it most. And I think that it's the people who are living under, languishing under, and resisting day in and day out Islamism and Sharia law in places like Iran and elsewhere. It's telling those people who need free expression most that they cannot and should not speak. Those who say that the fight over a Jesus and Mo cartoon trivializes the real reasons behind free expression are missing the point. There is a colossal fight against Islamism, and it is free expression that can challenge it. In an era where people are still hung in city squares for crimes against chastity, who are still buried in ditches to their waist or breast depending on their gender, and stoned until they are dead, in an era where there are people in prison for enmity against God, nothing could be more relevant and important. Progress in every era has been linked to criticizing that which is taboo and sacred. More often than not, it has been linked to criticizing or challenging religion. It's no different today. Our era's progress is intrinsically linked to a criticism of Islam and Islamism. As Kenan Malak has said, I'm going to end with a quote from him, "The giving of offense is not just inevitable, it's also important. Any kind of social change or social progress means offending some deeply held sensibilities. Or to put it another way, you can't say that is all too often the response of those in power to having their power challenged. To accept that certain things cannot be said is to accept that certain forms of power cannot be challenged. Human beings, as Salman Rushdie has put it, shape their futures by arguing and challenging and saying the unsayable, not by bowing their knee, whether to gods or to men." Thank you.